Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. This week, I want to do things a little bit differently. Slightly inspired by the circumstances which everybody here in the United Kingdom is living under. And slightly inspired by some of the stuff I've been reading at the moment. There's an awful lot to reflect on as we appear to be at the end of what you could call the neoliberal era. This is an enormous epoch that we are, sort of epochal moment, if you will, that we are reaching. You could argue that it's been approaching since 2008, the world economic crisis. That in Britain, the kind of convulsion of nationalist sentiment in the guise of Brexit in 2016 gave it a few more years, but in the kind of the clown-like character of Liz Truss, who a far more inept politician than her predecessor Johnson ever was, the kind of the end is in sight. Now, as you know, I mean, I do a little bit of current affairs in this podcast where it's relevant, and that means things like Ukraine, which have been so enormously significant and complex that we've done, some work to kind of navigate that. But I do want to obviously I tie in everything I do to an understanding of history and the roots of neoliberalism. I mean, it is to some degree a kind of a British phenomenon. It is, one could argue that in the democratic world, neoliberalism captured Great Britain to a greater extent than almost anywhere else, though there are aspects of neoliberal penetration into all first world economies. But they've held on in Britain for longer than anywhere else, and have penetrated deeper in Britain than anywhere else. However, the kind of the origins of neoliberalism are Austrian and Swiss. The amazing book Globalists by Quinn Slobodian, which is, if you want to understand the origins of neoliberalism, this is the book to get. Globalists by Quinn Slobodian looks at the twin crises of the First World War and the Great Depression, and looks at the origins of neoliberal thought which emerged in Austria and Switzerland, in Vienna and Geneva in the 1920s and the 1930s respectively. And in the 1920s there was an attempt to piece together the world order, a political attempt obviously with using the League of Nations and to recreate some kind of new meaningful world order, but an economic attempt as well. And there was a close and very complex relationship between the founders of the League of Nations, the intellectuals and political theorists behind that, and the economists of the kind of the European economists who looked at a world order where capitalism would be safe. Now, if you think of the context of the time, just after the First World War, the first threat, the existential threat to capitalism is the Russian Revolution. This is happening at the time, and this plays heavily on people's thoughts up until the early 1920s, when it becomes abundantly clear that Soviet communism is not going to spread throughout the rest of Europe. But the question about how one stabilises the world, or the world economic order, which had been really pieced together mainly by the British Empire, but also by other empires that had dominated Europe, Africa and Asia, all of which wiped away in the First World War. How one creates a new rules-based system. Now, there's a kind of an intellectual revolution within the kind of the proto-neoliberals in the late 1920s, early 1930s, when all of a sudden the work that was being done of trying to quantify the world economy and trying to kind of draw up a model of the world economy, people like Friedrich von Hayek suddenly throw this in the air and say, the Great Depression shows us the world economy is unknowable. It's total chaos. You cannot map it. You cannot quantify it. And you shouldn't even attempt to. It's a bit like trying to measure nature. Well, actually people do that quite successfully. But the world economy is a force of nature, and you should allow for it simply to be that. What you must do is protect it. You must protect the market from the predations of things like organised labour, the growth of the state. Of course, during the era of the Great Depression, statism is the answer in democratic and undemocratic societies. The New Deal, for example. And state intervention is, in the eyes of neoliberals, always wrong. This perfectly self-balancing, self-ordering system that produces particular sorts of results should always be protected. The fact that it produces particular sorts of results which almost always replicate inequality is simply a kind of part of its majesty. The underlying assumptions of people like Friedrich von Hayek and Ludwig von Mises were always in tune with the value and the importance of inequality. These ideas, for most of the period before the 1970s, were considered to be on the fringes of economic thought. Keynesianism was the dominant economic model for most of the 20th century. But Hayek argued after the Second World War that crises present opportunities, and it's the ideas that are lying around at the time are the ones which will be taken forward. Now, I guess the question always is what ideas are lying around. And it's unclear at the moment what would replace neoliberalism. If there is a particular ideology that would suffice. Any ideological position now surely would have to be based around, or one that would make sense and have some kind of coherence, would have to include the reality of climate breakdown on our planet. So, we'll see what emerges. But anyway, we're not about speculating about the future on this podcast. We're always trying to kind of explore the past. There's a great bit in David Edgerton's The Rise and Fall of the British Nation, where he says, in essence, in the 1970s, a kind of like a tier of the British middle classes and the establishment, the probably intelligence services, the army, and the bureaucracy, the civil service, that ruling middle tier of society, which is rather substantial, with buy-in from various kind of aspects of Britain's elites, had said essentially enough is enough when it came to Labour and what you would broadly call the kind of social democracy in Great Britain. The development of union power, the growth of the welfare state, the extent of nationalisation, and we were all associated with Britain's relative economic decline after the Second World War. The extent to which they are responsible for that is a matter for intense debate, and that's a subject of many other podcasts, so we won't go there right now. But there was essentially, in the mid to late 1970s, a British counter-revolution happened against the verdict of the Labour government of 1945. And we've been living really in the long tail of that counter-revolution for the following 50 years. And we've reached now the end of everything, the end of that. For a long period of time, that counter-revolution had popular appeal because it made a certain sort of economic sense. People with fresh and very bitter memories of union unrest in the 1970s supported Margaret Thatcher. The majority of Margaret Thatcher's mandate came from this one thing, which was the revulsion at Britain's striking trade unions during the winter of discontent. And the idea that that the trade unions had almost waged kind of economic warfare on the rest of the country, which isn't entirely fair at all. The unions were, by and large, their members were not kind of blood-curdling Trotskyites wanting to bring down and shoot the bourgeoisie and anything like that. These were people who had suffered from the problems of rapid inflation throughout the 1970s and did not like their living standards being eroded. These were car workers, these were miners, and these were public sector workers, all of whom wanted to participate in the mass consumerist society that emerged after the Second World War and wanted their fair share of it, and went on strike using the power of labour organising to achieve that. One of the things that Margaret Thatcher did during the 1980s was to break the power of organised labour. However, during the 1980s, independent from any action Thatcher took, we saw a radical decline in union membership, and this has all sorts of things to do with urbanisation and social change and people moving from place to place, and a whole bunch of kind of structural and generational factors. It is very helpful to Thatcher, certainly, and this radical decline comes really after the defeat of the miners in 1984, 1985. However, we live in a world now, or I live in a country where we have vastly weakened organised labour, and at the same time, and if this isn't direct causation, it's very close correlation, the returns to capital of GDP and productivity have vastly increased, and the returns to labour have vastly decreased. Now, we have Thatcherism has a kind of like an artificial sort of shot in the arm from council house sales and privatisation and North Sea oil. There were a glut of sell-offs in the 1980s and 1990s of Britain's national infrastructure, which now, if you look at the polling on privatisation, is wildly unpopular. And the thing about infrastructure and houses particularly is that you only get to sell these once. One of the aspects of the Local Government Act 1980, which initiated the sell-off of of council housing. This, to anybody listening around the world, these are houses for families that are rented from local government. These were sold off to their inhabitants for a very low cost. The money that was accrued from this was only half of it was allowed to go into building new houses for the next generation of people. Instead, it had to go into bringing down local taxes, rates as they were known at the same time. So this created an artificial housing boom. Not only were there new properties on the market,
but also rates across the country come down, and local authorities with high rates were normally Labour ones. So this was Margaret Thatcher's idea about democratising things so that high spending councils would get in trouble with their voters who wanted councils to spend less money and tax them less. The result was 4 decades of house price inflation, where you now have an entire generation of Generation Rent who perhaps will never be able to afford a house. And what happened, the irony here is you get a sort of a conservatism which embraced these sorts of neoliberal ideologies, shrinking the state, privatising things, giving people choice and opportunity, and all this sort of stuff. But this devours the base of kind of conservative conservatism. It devours the electoral base. People, in theory, I don't know how true this is, in theory become slightly more conservative with a small c, or perhaps with a big C, in their values when they take on the big responsibility of property and, you know, have families and all that sort of thing. But if you can't do that, you have an entire generation shut out of any likelihood of owning property at all, while the chances of them voting for you are pretty slim. So conservatism and neoliberal conservatism has been slowly, in that and a number of other regards, devouring itself over the years. The selling off of national infrastructure, the selling off of council houses, that was fine for Margaret Thatcher, the breaking of union power. And there are people that still remember her years very, very fondly. However, when you are somebody like the current incumbent Liz Truss, who doesn't understand any of that, evidently, but likes to kind of get out the dressing up box and wear kind of Thatcher outfits, metaphorically and actually, and do this kind of performative Thatcherism, which is you're doing it without any of the tools available to the Tories in the 1980s. The whole point about the neoliberal revolution is you could only do it once, and once it was done and you'd spent the proceeds of things like North Sea oil, you had alienated large parts of the country. The massive increase in support for Scottish nationalism is a product of Thatcherism, almost certainly. And you have sort of supercharged the right of the party. Margaret Thatcher, despite what the Brexiteers say, wasn't really the apostle of Brexit. She had a fairly balanced approach to Europe, which was to being, she was one of the architects of the single market. However, when it came to creating what she suspected would be a European super federal state, which was her fear, and devolving more powers to Europe at the Maastricht Treaty. Before we got to Maastricht, that's when Thatcher said, absolutely not. This is a trading arrangement. So there she had elements of kind of Europhilism and elements of kind of Euro wariness, shall we say. But she's obviously been kind of captured by the Tory right as this kind of apostle of Brexit, which is not the case. I mean, she voted to in the referendum to join the EU or the EEC, and voted to remain in there in the second referendum in 1975, when we had a kind of a referendum on membership. So here we are at this kind of this moment after 2008. Most of the economic assumptions that neoliberalism is based on around the world ceased to be true. The idea that
markets are fundamentally self-regulating, that it's not in the interests of big actors within markets to do things dishonestly or chaotically, because that will affect them in the end. This is a nonsense. I mean, and John Maynard Keynes could have said this, back in the 1920s. He said essentially, the animal instincts of capitalism mean that it has to be sort of saved from itself. You have to stop greed from hyper-motivating all decision-making. You have to disincentivize reckless risk-taking. You have to prevent bosses from sacking workers just because they feel like it and because it might affect the bottom line. Because one day you'll create the forces, as has been demonstrated throughout the 20th century, which will destroy the entire setup. Someone like John Maynard Keynes wasn't particularly on the left at all. This is somebody, broadly a liberal thinker, but somebody who concluded that the capitalist system is a system of rules. It has to be defined by rules. Politics structure always come before markets, and markets aren't naturally occurring. They're things that are created by states and created by societies, and they have certain parameters. The thing that Truss is described as being is a libertarian. Well, one might humbly submit that she probably hasn't really engaged with much libertarian philosophy at all. When it transpired recently that she had quoted Rick Perlstein's books on Reagan and Nixon as wonderful textbooks in essence on how to go about a sort of trickle-down economics deregulated society. Rick Perlstein, who is a kind of an unflinching critic of Reaganism, said, I cannot believe that this person has misinterpreted my work in this manner. The Reagan that Rick Perlstein presents to us is this sort of bumbling incompetent, really, a chancer and a fantasist who was able to exploit deep fissures in American society in order to present what turns out really just to be a myth. Perhaps this is part of the appeal. Anyway, Truss is described as a libertarian, and she is advised by people who from the various economic right-wing think tanks, things like the Institute for Economic Affairs, that are funded by God knows whom, because they never publish their accounts or their list of donors. Their influence might possibly now be shaken. The Institute for Economic Affairs recently, when the Conservative government under Truss published its mini budget, which led to market panic and the near collapse of Britain's pension funds, because Truss couldn't offered huge tax cuts to the top earners without any indication as to how these would be paid for, but simply essentially said to the markets for British debt, you'll find out eventually, which never really appeases people investing billions of pounds and dollars. This was the sort of thing that was initially music to the IEA's ears. There were people from the IEA and other right-wing think tanks who were rejoicing that Truss had been given the prime ministership, obviously without having to go through the trouble of a general election. And principally because they knew that she would put in place the entirety of their agenda, the sorts of things that they had been working towards for years. The freedom for employers to dismiss workers whenever they felt like, the total dissolution of things like the NHS, which in their view is a kind of a barrier towards free enterprise in the healthcare section. Those sorts of ideas, which when you look at it from the perspectives of economics, is about helping markets to function more efficiently. When there is state provision distorts markets where there are workers' protections. These distort markets, and you can't get rid of bad workers and get good ones, or better ones. This means that your system becomes very shaky. Your system becomes very inefficient, and markets aren't able to do exactly what they want. Of course. Anyway, the reason why this is held up as a kind of like an article of faith is that the functioning of markets in the kind of right-wing economic mind is sacrosanct, and this is perfectible markets, which, by the way, Hayek didn't even think markets were perfectible anyway. He said you would have to have kind of godlike omniscience in order to be able to do that. But anyway, the kind of the economic thinking is that markets are almost a kind of a road to a sort of capitalist utopia. Really, there's some kind of interesting links between that sort of Marxist-Leninist idea of the perfectible individual and perfectible society that it always exists as a kind of like a far distant utopia, and the neoliberal idea that perfectible markets will create perfectible situations and perfectible governments and perfectible people, and again that always exists in an imagined distant future. Well, we have now officially run out of road, economically speaking. We've finally had a go at the kind of the most concentrated form of neoliberalism, the sort of things that Thatcher herself probably wouldn't dare to have done. We've had a shot at that, and the British public have started to get a sense, I think, of what that really will entail. And of course, it is the most effective way. The reason why Britain's elites have always really fancied this is the most effective way of maintaining class rule, which is, whether that's economically beneficial to anyone or not, is beside the point. But the maintenance of class rule is what it's all about. And class rule isn't popular. It isn't possible without bringing along a chunk of the population at the same time, with whom you can kind of encourage to be to be supportive of the entire project, and give them some of the benefits. There don't seem to be any benefits to hand out now, and probably what we will see is, when there is a Labour government, which looks increasingly likely, we'll see a shift back towards something approaching a socially democratic society. That's not to say there aren't neoliberals in Labour. Yes, there are loads of them, and they have very close associations with their Conservative friends. One of Margaret Thatcher's often cited comments is that New Labour was one of her finest achievements. However, whether there will be a kind of widespread electoral support for things like privatisation, there's not much left to privatise really, or for the kind of the injection of markets into the workings of the state.
this is doubtful. The British economy and Britain's society have been left with such an enormous legacy of damage and chaos that it might be that a Labour government struggles on for 5 years and a newly resurgent Tory party comes back. But then again, the polling that has emerged recently that points to political annihilation for the Conservatives if Truss is allowed to stick around, which is partly to do with her. I don't want to call it ideology because I don't really think she's an ideologue particularly. I think she's sort of pays attention to the last thing she's heard. But it's partly to do with her political and economic positions. But it's partly to do with the fact that she's evidently kind of completely out of her depth and hasn't got really a clue about what's going on. But that polling would suggest that if they don't do something about her, then the Tory party is literally dead and buried. And here's where we reach the second great historical kind of jaw-dropping moment of. When we talk about the British Conservative Party being all but dead and buried, we're talking about the most successful democratically elected political party really in world history. There has been no force in politics like it anywhere else in the world for maintaining its power. And if we were to ponder for a moment what factors have led to this kind of collapse in the kind of esteem for the party, one of those factors must be surely neoliberalism itself, an ideology that people in Britain never really embraced as a kind of an article of faith, perhaps in the way that it was in America, partly due to the kind of a greater degree of British cynicism, I suspect. Most of the throughout the 1980s, the lack of what you would call a credible opposition and the lack of a meaningful alternative meant that Thatcherism had an unnaturally long spell of life. But now, following 2008 and the inability to find any other kind of operating system for the economy, and then following Brexit, which shrank Britain's economic horizons immeasurably, the decision now to institute this kind of absolutely pure turbocharged neoliberalism. And the backers of Brexit, the right-wing dark money backers of Brexit, really backed it for this particular moment to occur, where Britain's full transformation into a radical free market society would happen. Once we experience that, the electoral fortunes of the Conservative Party collapse. And it must take something quite profound for, as I said, the most successful political party in the democratic world to face this kind of implosion. And it's always the ideas, you know. And I think as we almost approach neoliberalism's kind of fall of the Berlin Wall moment, the question is, what eventually comes next? As something always does. Anyway, a bit of a different podcast today, but I hope you can see why it's topical. And I'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast. So take care. All the best. Bye-bye.